But I think that the discussion and the lead-off that we had this morning demonstrated the proletarian character, the role of the working class in the Chinese Revolution of 1925-27. But if one examines the developments in China between 1944 and 49, you'll see an entirely different relationship of class forces in the course of that revolution. But it's impossible really to approach the revolution of 44-49, which was interrupted by a short interregnum of late 45 and 46, without at the same time, at least in broad outline, charting the way developments took place following the defeat of the revolution of 25-27. Because in a certain sense, and it might seem a paradox, the revolution of 44-49 was an echo of the movement of 25-27. Now the first question we have to ask in this session is, what were the consequences for the Chinese people of the defeat of the revolution of 25-27? As we saw in the last session, China was ruled by a ruthless military dictatorship that suppressed all the democratic rights of the working class, that ruthlessly suppressed the movement of the peasants and the working class, that, as we saw in the last session, resulted in the murder of at least 35,000 Communist Party members in 1927 alone, and a total of about 50,000 in the course of that year. And here we're only talking about the cities, which by 1929, at a minimum estimate, had reached the level of about 150,000 people had perished directly as a result of the repressions of the Comintern regime. All the democratic rights, the right to strike, freedom of assembly, the right to vote, had all been eliminated and taken away by the Shanghai regime. This regime, by the Chiang Kai-shek regime, this regime that was utterly ruthless in relation to the smallest movement of the workers and peasants in China, at the same time was completely impotent against the encroachments of imperialism on China in the period that followed the 25-27 events. In particular, Japanese imperialism in the vanguard moved in the period that followed the revolution of 25-27 to carve out a more favorable position in terms of raw materials, in terms of markets, to satisfy the requirements of the growing Japanese industry at that stage. It's not at all accidental that Japanese imperialism was to the fore in the course of the dismemberment of China and the conquest of China at this particular stage. Because as with the position today, Japanese capitalism, Japanese imperialism does not have any native raw materials and look towards the reservoir, the reserves of China in terms of oil, particularly in terms of coal, and all the other raw materials that was absolutely necessary as far as Japanese industry and Japanese capitalism was concerned. They weren't, of course, alone in this, because American imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism in particular, took the opportunity that was presented by the weakness of China that followed the revolution of 25-27 to carve out for themselves even greater and more favorable spheres of influence than was the case which preceded the revolution itself. And during the period, roughly one could say, particularly from 1928 onwards, China more and more fell into the grip of the imperialist powers. Japanese imperialism, for instance, virtually conquered Manchuria in a number of campaigns which were interrupted when they consolidated their position between 1931 and 1935, particularly establishing the stooge regime, the Manchu core regime of Japanese imperialism. British imperialism and American imperialism joined in. And in this situation, when the national oppression of the Chinese people, when the national indignation of the Chinese people at the role of imperialism grew tremendously, Chiang Kai-shek and the Comintern regime were utterly incapable of facing the opposition of the imperialist powers. As a matter of fact, Chiang Kai-shek summed up his policy as a policy of non-resistance to the intervention of imperialism, even up to the extent where later on, towards the end of the 1930s, and in the early 1930s, Japanese imperialism had bombed, without any retribution whatsoever, Shanghai and some of the other cities of China. But later on, in the course of the war that I'll go into in a moment, Japanese imperialism actually found collaborators in the Comintern regime armies in particular. For instance, before the occupation of Shanghai, a Japanese general supplied the occupying troops of Japanese imperialism with all the necessary raw materials and oil in particular in order to occupy Shanghai. During this period also, Chinese industry was more and more taken over by imperialist concerns. British and Japanese capitalism, imperialism, controlled half the production of Chinese yarn in 1934. And that's only one example of the encroachments which were inflicted on China by the imperialist powers in the course of this period. And therefore, it was against this background of, on the one side, the enormous attacks on the conditions and the democratic rights of the working class, and on the other side, the greater and greater dismemberment of China, that one has to view the role of the Communist Party, of the Stalinists to be more exact, in the wake of the 1925-27 revolution itself. Because if you look at the way that the Communist Party leadership, even before they'd abandoned the idea of the working class being the main role in the revolution, when they still had tenuous links with the proletariat in the cities, when they concentrated most of their forces in the movement in the countryside, at that stage, following the defeat of the revolution of 25-27, when a military dictatorship with an iron grip exercised over all the major metropolitan areas of China, at this stage, Trotsky came forward with the idea, and the left opposition in Russia came forward with the idea, that in contradistinction to the period of the upswing of the revolution, when, as we pointed out in the last discussion, the slogan of Soviets should have been on the agenda, part of the program of the Communist Party. Now, he said, because the working class and the labor movement and the people as a whole in China had suffered a great defeat, it was necessary at this stage to come forward with a program of transitional demands on wages, on hours, on conditions, but also on all the democratic rights of the working class, the right to strike, freedom of assembly, and the crowning slogan would be a revolutionary constituent assembly, a parliament in other words, to be convened by the movement of the working class in the course of the struggle against the Comintern regime. The Chinese Communist Party leadership entirely rejected this program. In fact, this leadership, which after the resignation of the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, of Chen Qiuxiu, put in charge of the Chinese Communist Party was Li Lisan, who was a stooge of Stalin and the Stalinist bureaucracy in Russia. And this great genius, this leader of the Chinese working class and labor movement, came forward in the period, the third period of Stalinism, remember, when the slogan was Soviets everywhere, 101% and no more. Something similar, in other words, to the program put forward by the Workers' Revolutionary Party today, the revolution tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, or 10:30 at the latest. Something similar to all the ultra-left groups that exist in Britain today, except we have to say that the Chinese Communist Party exercised a much greater influence within China than the WRP and these minuscule sects will ever exercise in Britain. Were very similar in the approach that they adopted of rejecting democratic and transitional demands, which would have been a means of mobilizing the working class and the peasantry in China, because of course one of those programs of democratic demands would be land to the peasants, rejected that program that could have mobilized the workers and peasants around the Communist Party as the most democratic force in society to carry through the socialist transformation of society, linking up the struggle on democratic demands with the idea of the socialist transformation of society. That was completely rejected by the Communist Party leadership. So much so that we have many accounts that when workers went on strike in Shanghai, in Hankow, in Canton, and the other cities of China, and the Communist Party approached them in the course of that discussion, in the course of those strikes, and said, "Brothers, we must organize Soviets," the workers replied to them, "But Excellencies, you're very good and very talented, but please go away. All we can struggle for today is a piece of bread more in order to feed our bellies." In other words, the general idea of the revolution would have had to have been linked to those workers with the day-to-day struggles that they faced in the course of the struggle against against the capitalists and against the landlords. Now, as a result of the insane policy that followed the defeat of the 25-27 revolution, the Communist Party completely lost, and it's important for all the communists to take this on board, it's not just a general idea, it's something that is specific and concrete, that is related to the facts and figures given by the Chinese Communist Party leaders at that stage. The Communist Party lost its base in the industrial areas. If you like, it failed to it failed to become a working class party ever again, as a matter of fact. And just look at the facts and figures in relation to the Communist Party membership. Now, I gave the figure in the last session that in 1927 there were 60,000 members of the Communist Party. According to the reports of party sources themselves, 58% of the party membership was proletarian in composition. In 1928, because of murders, because of the persecution of the Comintern, that had shrunk. The membership of the Communist Party had allegedly grown, but mainly because they'd abandoned the cities and gone into the countryside. But the working class base of the Communist Party had shrunk to 10% of the total. In 1929, only 3% of the Communist Party members were industrial workers. In 1930, it was 2.5%, in the earlier part of 1930, and 1.6% by September of that year. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party was no longer a proletarian party in the Marxist sense of the term. What had happened is that the ex-leaders of the proletariat, the ex-leaders of the Shanghai and Canton working class in particular, following the 25-27 debacle, had gone into the countryside. These ex-proletarian leaders, to begin with, they didn't even find a big echo amongst the peasantry. As Mao Zedong himself reported subsequently, they were attacked, as a matter of fact, by the peasants, because the peasants were used to armies coming across their territory, and originally the Red detachments appeared to be just another marauding army, similar to all the other armies that had come before. But what happened was a number of Red armies, allegedly Red armies, had been created in the countryside in different bases. One of them led by Mao Zedong in Hunan, who subsequently became the political leader of the Red Army, with Chu Tai as the military leader, which eventually, I don't have time to go into it, eventually ended up in Kiangsi in the early 1930s. And even at this stage, when the Red Army scored spectacular victories over Chiang Kai-shek and the forces of the Comintern, who, as I pointed out, was utterly incapable of facing up to the attacks of imperialism, but directed all his energies against attacking the small forces, as it was at that stage, of the Reds in the predominantly peasant areas. And no more brilliant pages, as a matter of fact, have been written in Chinese history than the victories that were scored between 1929 and 1934 by the forces of the Reds. The Comintern armies, 4, 5, and 6 times stronger, were sent against the forces, particularly in the Kiangsi province, in the Kiangsi area where the Red Army was based. But these forces are incapable of militarily dislodging the forces of the Red Army. It was only after Chiang Kai-shek had assembled an army of 500,000, and rather than punitive expeditions going to attack the Red Army, what happened was that these armies surrounded the Red districts, and then armed with all the resources of imperialism, when the Reds didn't have a single aeroplane, the Comintern armies had 300 aeroplanes and bombed Kayangsi, entirely circled the area. Then Mao Zedong and the leadership of the Red Army decided to break out. But even at this stage, with the great genius of Trotsky, in a certain sense, the great foresight, foreshadowing of what happened almost 20 years later, and a very important article that enough attention has not been paid to, in our opinion, in 1932, at a time when the peasant armies of Mao Zedong were scoring brilliant victories over the Comintern, Trotsky, in a very important article, posed the question of what would happen if these peasant armies, after defeating the landlords, and in Kayangsi, by the way, they immediately drove out the landlords. If these peasant armies entered the cities, what would happen? And he pointed out that the leaders of the Red Armies were ex-workers. The Red Armies were made up predominantly of peasants, also of refugees from the various warlords, and even in the publications of the Communist Party itself, there were complaints very often of sections of what we would call the lumpen proletariat, and the lumpen agricultural population joining the Red Armies. In other words, it was a peculiar admixture that we've seen in China over millennia, over a period of 1,000 years. Traditional peasant armies that had risen against the oppressions of the landlords and the capitalists. But he posed the question, what would happen if the Red Armies entered the cities? And in that he drew on the experience of Russia. And he pointed out that in Russia, originally, the armies, the Red Army was made up predominantly of proletarian detachments, of workers, who fought the whites throughout the length and breadth of Russia. At the same time, there were peasant detachments that arose. And so long as they were fighting against the whites, there was a common cause between the Red and various peasant armies, the Green armies and other armies of a peasant character. But once that task had been overcome, the different character of the armies came to the fore. Something that we discussed in the last session. The tendency of the proletariat, organized in big industry, is to collectivize industry, is to plan and to organize. The tendency of the peasantry, because it's so stratified, it's so heterogeneous, is to divide up, is to share out the booty. And he pointed out that what if these allegedly Red Armies would enter the cities? Is it not possible, he said, that it would clash with the working class, it would be hostile to the working class, and it would fuse with the capitalist class and carry through a classical capitalist development? Very similar, on the basis of the new foundations of China, as we'd seen throughout the whole preceding 2,000 years. Now that prognosis of Trotsky, that prediction of Trotsky was not entirely borne out, but he correctly foreshadowed the main features that were played in the 1944-1949 revolution itself. But in August to November 1934, the Red Army surrounded, decided to break out. Don't have time to go into it, but again, it's one of the greatest pages, if you like, of military and social history, certainly in terms of China and indeed of the world, that the heroic detachments of the Red Army, over a period of exactly a year, staged the famous Long March under the direction of Chu Tai and Mao Zedong, and ended up in Yan'an. A route that took them over a distance of something like 7,000 miles of Chinese territory against a force that was 5, 6, and even 10 times the number of the Red detachments themselves. Chiang Kai-shek was so preoccupied with the Reds that he utterly abandoned the approaches of imperialism on China in order to concentrate to wipe out the forces of the Red Army. That resulted, as we know, in eventually them finding refuge in the mountain fasts of Yan'an a year later. And then as a result of the attacks on the Red Armies, eventually at the same time as the encroachments of imperialism was taking place, eventually what you had is, even within the Comintern itself, and within the Comintern armies in particular, there was enormous hostility, a developing hostility growing, first of all to the encroachments of imperialism, and secondly the impotence of Chiang Kai-shek and the Comintern in facing up to these attacks. That culminated in 1936, when the Comintern General Staff had ordered the armies in Shensi, which is facing the Red detachments, to attack the Red Army once again. There was enormous discontent. They reluctantly attacked and were defeated. And as a result of that, the army was in a state of revolt. So Chiang Kai-shek, as is his wont, decided to fly to the battlefront, decided to fly to Xi'an in order to deal with the rebellious detachments. While he was there, the Comintern armies rose in revolt, and Chiang Kai-shek was found skulking on the mountainside in his nightshirt. He was brought before the Comintern General Staff, before the Comintern rank and file, and the cry went through the Comintern armies at that stage: bring the butcher of the Chinese people to a people's trial. Put him on trial. Smash once and forever the Comintern and face up to the struggle against Japanese imperialism. But as was the case in 25-27, once again, the Chinese Communist Party leadership came to the rescue of Chiang Kai-shek, because Zhou Enlai, as a representative of Mao Zedong, flew into Xi'an. He walked into the room that Chiang Kai-shek occupied. Chiang Kai-shek turned white, because let us recall, Zhou Enlai was in the headquarters of the General Labour Union in 1927, at the time of the suppression of the Shanghai working class. He'd seen the butchery of Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek turned white when Zhou Enlai marched in, but completely unsuspecting to him, took him by surprise, Chiang Kai-shek clicked his heels and saluted him as the Generalissimo, as the leader of the Chinese Revolution. In other words, the leader, the very fountainhead of the counter-revolution, was in the hands of the Reds at that stage, where the troops of the Comintern were prepared to go over. He discussed successfully with Chiang Kai-shek for about 2 days, and eventually a united front was forged, an allegedly united front that the Communist Party had been advocating since the World Comintern Conference of 1935, when the third period was abandoned, and the idea of popular frontism, of uniting with the progressive bourgeoisie, was introduced by the Comintern internationally. The Communist Party leaders in China, firmly under the control of Mao Zedong, at this stage were proposing a united front with the Comintern against Japanese imperialism, and eventually, as we know, they linked up in the united front in 1936-1937. This in turn was the signal for Japanese imperialism to launch a full-blown military campaign in order to capture Chinese territory. And it's very interesting to examine the process of the United Front, this alleged United Front, that unfortunately I don't have the time to go into here. But what's important about the whole experience of the 30s is that in the first period, when the Red Armies went into the Kiangsi, when Mao Zedong and the remnants of the Chinese Communist Party went into the peasant areas, in that period they drove out the landlords and began to carry through a land reform. But on the basis of signing this United Front program with the Comintern, then in the red areas what happened, as a precondition for this alleged United Front, and Trotsky, by the way, said at this stage, one wouldn't rule out the possibility of coordinated military action between the forces of the Comintern, even led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the forces of the Reds, on condition that there was complete independence of the forces of the Reds and of the labour movement in China, and secondly, that as well as fighting Japanese imperialism, the strongest card in fighting Japanese imperialism, as the experience of Russia would show, would be to carry through a social program of land to the tiller, of land to the workers, and of the factories to the proletariat. Now, as we know, the Reds didn't do that, but on the contrary, what happened was that within the red areas, you had actually a situation where some of the land was retained by the rich peasants. And the rich peasants began more and more to creep into the ranks of the Red Army and the embryonic state that existed in the Red areas. Even Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong complained about this. At the same time, in the towns that were controlled by the Reds, you also had a similar situation as we saw in Shanghai and Canton earlier on. Class collaboration, a deliberate attempt to restrict the movement of the working class. The workers shouldn't ask for more than what the capitalists are prepared to give, and so on. But the most important feature of this so-called United Front was that in the course of the war itself, Japanese imperialism utterly smashed the Comintern forces. Comintern forces retreated to the west of China, the central and the western part of China, and really the only army, the only force that fought the Japanese imperialists were the forces of the Reds in northern China, not so much in Manchuria. It was largely not really affected until about 1945. But the only force that combated Japanese imperialism were the Reds. And Japanese imperialism, because of its ruthless program, summed up in the slogan of the three alls. And the three alls meant loot all, burn all, and kill all, was the slogans of Japanese imperialism. The utter ruthlessness of Japanese imperialism drove the peasantry into the ranks of the Red Army. And as a result of this movement, what you had was that Japanese imperialism merely held the major industrial areas and a narrow strip of land along the railways. The rest of China, in the areas that the Reds were operating in, were already, in the earlier part of the war, under the influence of the Red Army and under the influence of the leadership of the Red Army. It was largely a peasant movement. Already in these areas we saw the embryo of a state machine. In 1945, for instance, at the end of the Second World War, the total area that was controlled by the Reds came to about 90 million. They had such an embryonic state power that they produced their own currency. That's an indication of the power and the strength that already existed as far as the Red Armies were concerned. The Comintern hardly fought against Japanese imperialism, an occasional engagement against Japanese imperialism. The calculations of Chiang Kai-shek was that he would keep his forces in the west. As soon as Japanese imperialism was overthrown, with the assistance of American imperialism, you merely occupied the eastern seaboard of China and the north of China, and we would have a repetition of the events of 1925-27 and the capitulation of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. That didn't happen for the reasons that I'll go into in a moment. But before dealing with that, I think it's important to see as well that most of the energies of the Comintern at this period was directed in an attack against the Reds, where it was possible for the Comintern to attack the Reds. In 1941 and 42, in the crossing of a number of rivers, when the Red Armies were attempting to come into combat with Japanese imperialism, the Comintern, treacherously in contradiction to the agreed so-called United Front program, attacked the forces of the Red Army. Eventually, as we know, Japanese imperialism was defeated in the course of the Second World War, particularly in the aftermath of the dropping of the atom bomb. In 1945, Japanese imperialism capitulated. And then Chiang Kai-shek was faced with an enormous dilemma. First of all, the Stalinist bureaucracy intervened in Manchuria, and in the 9 days war, they occupied practically the whole of Manchuria, and it was obvious that the Stalinist bureaucracy were even considering the establishment of a stooge regime. Li Li-san, that I mentioned before, as the stooge of Stalin, who was actually replaced in 1932, I think it was, by Wang Ming and then by Mao Zedong. This very same Li Li-san, who'd been in exile in Moscow, then was brought back on the heels of the Red Army troops in Manchuria, and a half-hearted attempt was made by the Stalinist regime in Russia to establish their presence, to establish their position in Manchuria. Because Manchuria controlled, actually entailed most of the industry, most of the industrial weight of China at that particular stage. So what happened is that the Stalinist bureaucracy occupied Manchuria in the same hooligan fashion in which they carried it through in Germany. They looted the whole of Manchuria of its factories, of its technical expertise, and transported it back to Russia. A complete violation, as a matter of fact, of all the principles of internationalism that Lenin and the Bolsheviks had established in 1917. The narrow nationalist bureaucratic concept of Stalin resulted in the looting of Manchuria. And Chiang Kai-shek, from the western areas that he occupied, was flown in by American imperialism into Manchuria. In the meantime, the Red troops had penetrated Manchuria, and Chiang Kai-shek was now in a position that Japanese imperialism was in the past. That he had the towns and some parts of the railways, those parts of the railways that the peasants had not ripped up, in a very famous Chinese peasant tradition, they bent the rails to make them unusable. Chiang Kai-shek then had to think about importing his troops and material into northern China, into Manchuria, by sea, with the assistance of American imperialism. But at the end of the Second World War, there was tremendous pressure on the Red forces, which was predominantly a peasant force, to come to an agreement with Chiang Kai-shek. Because, of course, there was a certain war weariness in 1945. So in 1945, the Red forces decided to negotiate with the Comintern. And at this stage, it's important to see the militant tendency is the only tendency, nationally and internationally, that has a clear understanding, we believe, of the way events developed in China between 1944-49 and in particular between 1946 and 49. Now, I mentioned before that Lee and Trotsky expected that when the Red armies entered the city, they would either fuse with the capitalists and a classical capitalist development would take place, or they might even do what they did in 25-27, capitulate to the Comintern armies. But at the end of the Second World War, let us recall, it's 2 decades now since the revolution of 25-27. Chinese society is utterly bankrupt. Chinese society is in an impasse. Landlordism and capitalism had had its opportunity in those 2 decades to solve the problems of Chinese society and have been found wanting, incapable of solving the land problem, incapable of unifying China and impotent against imperialism, incapable of stopping the bloodletting and the suffering of the Chinese people. For instance, all the comrades here know about the enormous inflation that existed in Germany in 1923. But how many, even Marxists, know of the rate of inflation that existed in China in 1946 to 1948? A rate of inflation that put in the shade the rate of inflation that existed in Germany in 23. I think inflation increased in 47 by 10,000%, 10 to 11,000% in the case of 1 year. Money became completely worthless. The whole of Chinese society was completely disorganized, as a matter of fact, as a result of the developments which took place throughout that year. Let us also recall as well that on the basis of a minimum estimate, roughly 1 million people had perished in China, not because of Japanese imperialism, but directly as a result of the measures of the Comintern at this particular period. But at the end of the war, there was pressure, there was a war weariness of the Comintern and the Communist Party to collaborate. And some Marxists in the West, alleged Marxists in the West, said, look, Mao Zedong is attempting to capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. And I'll come to that a little bit later on. But it's interesting, when you look at the program that Mao Zedong put forward in 1946, and which he subsequently put forward in 1949. What was the program that he put forward? And it was correct, by the way, for the Red Armies, for the leadership of the Red Armies, for the Communist Party leadership, to negotiate with the Comintern, to make it clear that they were not the ones who were in favor of perpetuating the war, but they were in favor of peace. What was the program that Mao Zedong put forward? It's quite interesting to read this program. Number 1, punish war criminals. Who were the war criminals? Mostly the tops of the Comintern. That, by the way, in Manchuria, had taken over lock, stock and barrel those Chinese collaborators with Japanese imperialism and absorbed them into the Comintern armies. War criminals with the leadership of the Comintern. Number 2, abrogate the bogus constitution on which the Comintern rested. Number 3, abolish the pretended legitimacy of the Comintern power. This meant the Comintern was no longer to be considered the legitimate holder of public power, political power. Reform all reactionary armies in accordance with democratic principles. Confiscate bureaucratic capital. Now that was a pseudonym for saying take over capitalism, nationalize, in effect, the capital that was controlled by the tops of the Comintern and the supporters of the Comintern. Reform the agrarian system, abrogate treaties of national betrayal, convoke a political consultative conference without the participation of reactionary elements. Now there was a short interregnum in which Japanese and American imperialism tried to exert pressure for a coalition. That wasn't successful, as we know, and this in turn resulted in the resumption of the war in 1946. And really the civil war in China took place between 1946 and 1949. And if you look at the situation in Chinese society at that stage, landlordism and capitalism was completely impotent and was bankrupt and was incapable of showing a way forward for Chinese society at that stage. It wasn't the situation that Trotsky had anticipated in the pre-war period. You even had some Trotskyists, as I pointed out before, who were saying that Comintern is attempting to capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. But in a whole series of battles that took place between 46 and 49, first of all in Manchuria, where the forces of the Comintern were smashed. Eventually they were surrounded in the cities, and eventually Manchuria fell. And then the force of the Red Army moved into the eastern provinces and to the central provinces of China. But if you look at the concatenation of factors there that existed in Chinese society at that particular stage, it was obvious why the whole situation could not develop in the way that Trotsky had anticipated before the war. First of all, in all the military attack and military clashes that took place, it's false to think, for instance, that it was military supremacy which guaranteed the results of victory for the Red Army. Because the Comintern had overwhelming military superiority. There were roughly 1 million forces organized in the Red Army. There were 5 million organized in the Comintern armies. The Comintern armies were armed with the latest word and technique by American imperialism. But what happened is in every battle that took place, it wasn't so much that they were militarily defeated, the Comintern, but the propaganda of the Red Army, of particularly land for the tillers. And under the impetus of the mass movement of 47, Mao Zedong and the leadership of the Communist Party were forced to adopt a much more radical land program than had existed in the Red areas in the previous period. And as a result of that pressure and the propaganda of the Red Army, that was like tanks going through. The propaganda of the Red Army was like tanks going through the forces of the Comintern. And when they defeated an army of the Comintern, the Reds didn't take them prisoner. They released the Comintern troops. What the capitalists call brainwashing techniques took place. They imbued them with the propaganda, particularly the idea that we want you to take the land, or smash landlordism and capitalism, and they released them. And that was more effective than aeroplanes, than bullets, than all the latest word in armaments. That was successful in disintegrating the armies of the Comintern itself. That eventually resulted, as we know, in the utter collapse of the Comintern in 47 and 48. But even as late as 48, there were alleged Trotskyists who were saying that Mao Zedong was attempting to capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. And as one wag in America said, yes, that's true. The only problem is he can't catch him. Because Chiang Kai-shek and the forces of Chiang Kai-shek were running away from the forces of the Reds, from the north of China right down the eastern seaboard to the southern coast of China itself. Another argument that was put forward by the American Socialist Workers Party, by the way, and alleged Trotskyists, this is in 1948, when they said that Mao Zedong will never cross the Yangtze. And when that edition of the Militant, nothing to do with our Militant, but the American Militant hit the streets, Mao Zedong was 40 miles beyond the Yangtze. What they were operating with was all the old formulas that Trotsky had put forward in the interwar period, but which they were incapable of relating to and understanding the changed situation and the concatenation of factors and forces that had arisen in the period of 49, 44, 49. Chinese landlordism and capitalism was utterly impotent to develop Chinese society any further. A vacuum existed in Chinese society. Secondly, American imperialism in particular, imperialism was not able to intervene in China directly, because in the aftermath of the war, throughout the whole of Asia, there were massive movements of American troops wanting to go home. The famous Bring the Boys Home movement developed throughout the whole of the world. So American imperialism could supply Chiang Kai-shek with the latest word and technique as far as armaments were concerned, which, by the way, was subsequently captured by the Reds and used against American imperialism in Korea. They were able to supply him with the latest word and technique, but they weren't able to bolster up the armies of the Comintern because of the disintegrating effects of the social situation that existed in China at that particular time. Imperialism was utterly incapable of intervening. And that is summed up, by the way, in one famous or infamous incident, depending upon your point of view, took place in 1948 or 49. I can't remember the exact date at this particular moment. That was the famous Amethyst incident. Let us remember, as we saw in the last discussion, in Shanghai and in Canton in 1926, at the time of the revolution, the British imperialists brazenly shot down Chinese workers and peasants. And yet in 1948 in China, when the battleship the Amethyst managed to sneak down the Yangtze River and evade the red gunboats, that was proclaimed as a great victory in the Daily Express, in the Times and the Financial Times. That was a graphic illustration of the impotence, of the incapacity for imperialism to intervene against the Chinese Revolution. And in this vacuum, notwithstanding all the phrases and all the speeches of Mao Zedong, of all the statements that he put forward, where he said, for instance, that capitalism will last for 100 years, the Trotskyists, the Marxist tendency gathered around the Militant, and we trace our antecedents back, right back to that period, argued that inevitably, that Mao Zedong coming into the cities, the development would not be, as was the case as Trotsky anticipated, in the interwar period, of a Bonapartist army. This was a peasant army that entered the cities. It wouldn't be a movement like the October Revolution of 1917, a conscious movement of the proletariat. It'd be a peasant army that would enter the cities, and instead of fusing with the capitalists and a classical capitalist development taking place, because of the bankruptcy of Chinese capitalism, because of the weakness of imperialism on a world scale, because of the strength of Stalinism that had come out of the Second World War, because also Mao Zedong and the leaders of the Red Army had a model of the kind of state and the kind of society that they could create in Chinese society, the developments that were likely to take place in China would not be as Trotsky anticipated in the interwar period. But on the contrary, Mao Zedong and the leaders of the Red Army were not communists, by no stretch of the imagination, in the classical sense of the term, were not Marxists in the sense that they didn't base themselves on the proletariat, but they were deadly fearful of the movement of the proletariat. Look at all the statements that were made by the Red Army and by the Red leaders in the period of the Civil War itself. They insisted that the workers should carry on and work normally. Look, for instance, at the statement that was issued by the Red Army just before the occupation of Peking. Those who strike or destroy will be punished. Those working in these organizations, factories, should work peacefully and wait for the takeover. That really sums up the role of the Bonapartist elite that was at the head of this peasant army. They were afraid of the movement of the proletariat. The working class in the major industrial areas of China was largely passive in this period, where workers did go out on strike when the Red Army advanced and went to greet them with flags, went to greet the Red Army with flags. They were either arrested or they were shot down by the Red Army. Proletarian movements along the lines of the October Revolution of 1917. In the vacuum that existed in Chinese society, what happened is that this largely peasant army entered the cities, balancing between the classes with the passivity of the working class and the proletariat, at one stage leaning on the capitalist class, or sections of the capitalist class, the so-called national bourgeoisie, leaning on the peasantry and on the working class at different stages as well. Gradually Mao Zedong created the state in the image of Moscow. Not like the developments that we had in Russia. I think it's very important for the comrades to understand this. In Russia we had a proletarian revolution, where the working class played the main role in the revolution. That revolution, let us remember, in the famous words of John Reed, with the 10 days that shook the world. The Russian Revolution led directly to the 1918 revolution in Germany, to the Hungarian Revolution, to revolutionary events in Italy where the workers occupied the plants in 1920. An indication of the way that the proletariat internationally identified with the Russian Revolution was paradoxically given in the New York Times. The propaganda against the Russian Revolution puts in the shade the lies and the filth of the Daily Express, for instance, today. Because the New York Times carried an articles, 134 articles, between 1918 and 1921, which said that either Trotsky had bumped off Lenin, or Lenin had bumped off Trotsky. And usually it was in a drunken brawl, by the way. One headline was Trotsky assassinates Lenin in drunken brawl. Now, if that was in a serious journal such as the New York Times, imagine the kind of stories that would appear in the yellow press. But despite the propaganda, the working class internationally instinctively knew that their class was in power. It inspired them. There were democratic organizations of control and management in the form of the Soviets. Nothing of this character existed in China between 46 and 49, or in the aftermath for that matter. Any spontaneous movement of the proletariat, any movement of the industrial working class to set up organizations of self-expression, of control of the new state, were ruthlessly suppressed by the Bonapartist leaders of the peasant armies that entered the cities of China. And therefore we have to say, comrades, that without any question, the Chinese Revolution of 1944-49, or 46-49 was the latest phase of the revolution, was undoubtedly one of the greatest events in human history. It was the second greatest event, only after the revolution of October 1917. Here 1/4 of mankind stepped onto the stage of history and put behind it once and forever the disease, the ravages, the misery that landlordism and capitalism meant for them. The Chinese Revolution inspired and gave a push to the colonial revolution in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. An enormous event of great historic importance, but at the same time an event that first of all couldn't have the same international repercussions and reaction from the working class internationally on the one side, and on the other side, because it's established a planned economy where gradually most of industry was taken over and a thoroughgoing land reform was carried through and completed, but at the same time the establishment of a one-party totalitarian regime. The idea that there was a democracy in China in 1949 is fairy tales, as a matter of fact, only for the consumption of children of 10 or less. If you look at the situation at that particular stage, it's true that Mao Zedong formed a coalition with the Comintern. To be more exact, he formed a coalition with the People's Comintern that had a total membership of 200 in China at that stage. Not exactly a mighty force against the background of 3/4 of a billion people. In other words, what happened is that Mao Zedong
to use the phrase of Trotsky, and this is where a lot of Trotskyists made mistakes in relation to the Chinese Revolution, or alleged Trotskyists. Trotsky said in the 1930s, for instance, in Spain, that the Stalinists had formed a coalition with the shadow of the capitalist class. And what he meant by that is that the capitalists had all fled to the side of Franco, and the working class organisation formed the coalition with the shadow of the capitalist class in the form of the ex-representatives of the capitalists in Spain. Gradually this shadow got a substance, and the workers' movement in Republican Spain was smashed. And in China, one could say, in a certain sense, Mao Zedong carried through a coalition with the shadow of the capitalist class. But there was a crucial difference in China. As opposed to Spain in 1936-39, the real levers of state power were not in the hands of the bourgeois partners of the Red Army, of the so-called People's Comintern, but were in the hands of Mao Zedong, of the Red Army, and the so-called Communist Party of China, particularly the police, the army, and so on. In other words, the levers of state power were in the hands of Mao Zedong. And therefore, what we had in China was the development of a one-party totalitarian regime based upon a progressive system, if you like, of a planned economy, the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy, which was gradually introduced in China, and a thoroughgoing land reform. Comrade Chairman and comrades, only by understanding the relationship of forces in the Chinese Revolution is it possible to approach the very complex processes that are taking place in Asia, in Africa and Latin America at the present time. Because it's not at all, these processes are not at all according to the schema laid down by Marx, by Engels, by Lenin, or even by Trotsky. Much more complex processes are taking place in the colonial and semi-colonial world, which we can understand if all the comrades have a thorough grasp of the features of the Chinese Revolution, of the way that that revolution developed, not of the working class playing the main role in the revolution, but of the peasantry entering the cities, of a Bonapartist regime being established, which established a planned economy, which, if you like, historically expressed the interests of the working class, in the sense that they introduced a planned economy, but in no sense was it a regime along the lines of the Bolshevik regime of 1917. But on the contrary, unfortunately, because the way the situation developed in China, the Chinese working class will have to pay with a new revolution, a political revolution in China, before the way will be cleared for Chinese society to move towards the establishment of a socialist society in the context of a World Socialist Federation. But in order to understand how that is likely to happen in this period that is going into, and the way China has developed in the last 20 years, it's necessary for us to understand the main forces in the Chinese Revolution, and I hope the comrades have understood the major features that I've expressed here today in order to approach the struggle that will be taking place in China and indeed throughout the colonial and semi-colonial world in the period that we're going into. To see is I agree with the point that was raised by the comrade at the front in relation to Cuba, the enormous attractive power of Cuba to the starving masses, because that's what it is now. For instance, in the Caribbean, let alone in Africa, in Latin America. If anybody saw the program, for instance, on I think it was Thursday night on the TV on Jamaica, which showed the enormous problems that exist in Jamaica, and that's just one example of the tremendous problems that exist in the Caribbean at the present time, that's facing a catastrophe, that's facing a crisis. And therefore Cuba is enormously attractive. I think it's got the highest income per capita now, partly of course because the Russian bureaucracy finances them to the tune of about $3 million a day at the moment, but they've got the highest per capita income in the whole of Latin America with the exception of Venezuela. And the only reason why Venezuela has got a higher living standard is because of the oil. And therefore that's of enormous attractive power as far as the masses in the Caribbean are concerned. The same thing exists in Latin America. But at the same time, it's noticeable, even in the case of Jamaica, where you have a working class with a certain tradition, that they're attracted on the one side by the advantages of a planned economy over the chaos of capitalism, of landlordism and capitalism that exists in the Caribbean and the whole of the Latin America. But at the same time, they're somewhat repelled by the one-party totalitarian regime, although we have to say that both in the case of China and in the case of Cuba, they are still very popular regimes as far as the masses in Cuba are concerned. As far as the masses in China are concerned, there's a difference between the regimes of Cuba, of China, of Vietnam for that matter, and the situation that exists in Russia. Because in Russia you have a one-party totalitarian regime where the Stalinist regime has completely outlived itself, where society is not capable of going forward any further without overthrowing the one-party totalitarian regime. In a certain sense, that's not the case in China, it's not the case in Cuba, because they're very backward societies, and the advantage of a planned economy means their rate of development is 2, 3 and even more times greater than the rate of development of the neighbouring capitalist states. It's not the case in Russia, where now the rate of growth in Russia is much less than Japan, is only half, as a matter of fact, of the rate of growth of Japan, which is an indication, an expression of the tremendous accumulated crisis that exists in Russia at this particular stage. So therefore, those regimes of Cuba and regimes of China are popular, first of all in the eyes of the masses in China and Cuba, in the sense that they can still take society forward, they can still develop the productive forces. They're fulfilling in these countries, if you like, what capitalism, the role that capitalism played in the West in the course of the 19th century, which landlordism and capitalism was not able to play in these backward colonial and semi-colonial countries. Now, that does not mean to say, either in Cuba or in Latin America, that the masses are not suspicious, to put it no more than that, of one-party totalitarian regimes. Even, by the way, in India, where I was, as I said before, 2 years ago, it was very noticeable. In the discussions with the most advanced workers in India, as soon as you said, well, it's a one-party regime and it will take away democratic rights, they said, well, we don't want that. We want a planned economy. We want what they would call socialism. But we don't want a totalitarian one-party regime. That is particularly the case when in Latin America, the whole of Latin America, with the exception of Venezuela, and in a certain sense Colombia, although that's very dubious as well, the whole of Latin America is covered by military police dictatorships. If you're going to overthrow one military police dictatorship, you're not going to easily agree with a new one-party regime being established. Now, there are differences in different countries, because in most of the countries of Latin America, or the main countries of Latin America, it's not what you would call a classical colonial situation. It's a semi-colonial country with a very industrial, developed proletariat, where the main forces in the revolution would be the industrial working class. There's no doubt about that. Absolutely no doubt about that. The idea of guerrilla war might have some effect in some of the countries where the peasantry is a higher proportion of the population, or even that is dubious. In the case of Bolivia, for instance, the miners would play the main role, and the industrial working class would play the main role in the course of the revolution itself. So therefore, as far as this question of totalitarianism is concerned, we have to be very careful not to have an arrogant attitude, and I'm not suggesting any of the comrades had that here today, not to have an arrogant attitude towards the colonial and semi-colonial masses. Like, for instance, the Tribune tendency would say, well, democracy is all very well, or the Communist Party, democracy is all very well in the advanced countries, but for these lesser breed without the law, because that's what it comes down to use the phrase of Kipling, the masses in Africa, or Asia, or Latin America, well, a little bit of what Nkrumah called, I think, guided democracy, which is guided by a privileged elite from the top. In other words, it's a one-party totalitarian regime. That's all you can expect of these very backward and barbaric peoples that exist in these countries. That's a step forward for them. That's absolutely wrong. It's nothing which it's not what a Marxist would adopt. On the contrary, we would put forward the idea in the backward countries of basing ourselves on the proletariat, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, another question was raised about the role of Stalin in relation to the Chinese Revolution, and in particular in relation to the developments of 44-49. Well, one of the comrades in the previous discussion said, well, perhaps Stalin was a bit cleverer than we give him credit for. But if you examine the role of Stalin in the Chinese Revolution of 44-49, not only did he give wrong advice in 25-27, he gave wrong advice in 44-49 as well. Because when Mao Zedong visited him and discussed with him, Stalin advised him, and he advised the Chinese Communist Party to dissolve the Red Army and to fuse the Red Army with the Comintern. And of course, because the discussions were taking place in Russia, and Mao being very polite, he listened to Stalin, he nodded his head wisely and sagely at the advice of Stalin, and then of course went back to China and did exactly the opposite. But the advice of Stalin was entirely false in relation to the Chinese Revolution. But there was another facet to it as well. Because if you look at the development of the revolutions in the colonial world, or in the post-war world, it's no accident that the two states that came into a collision with the Russian bureaucracy is Tito in Yugoslavia and Mao Zedong and the Stalinist regime in China. It's no accident, because in both of those societies, the task of liberating those societies from the Nazis in the case of Yugoslavia, from the Japanese imperialists and imperialism as a whole in China, was not the work of the Russian Red Army from the outside, but was the role of the independent role of the guerrilla movement within the country itself. That was true of Yugoslavia as it was true of China as well. And these movements had already had an independent base, separate and apart from the Stalinist bureaucracy. That's why I deliberately emphasised that point in my opening remarks, that in China they even had their own currency in the liberated areas. They had a whole apparatus, a state apparatus, the embryo of a new state, ready to move into the cities and in effect to replace the Comintern regime. And therefore, in that situation, there was already an incipient clash between the movement in China, the Stalinist regime in China, and the Comintern and the Stalinist bureaucracy in Russia itself. It was already there. In fact, we didn't say that ex post facto. In the course of the Chinese Revolution itself, our tendency predicted the inevitability of a clash between the Chinese Stalinist regime and the Russian bureaucracy. It was even there in the case of Manchuria. Bill asked the question about Manchuria. Well, what happened is at the end of the war, the Russians, in a lightning 9-day war, the so-called 9-day war, occupied most of Manchuria, took over most of Manchuria, particularly the cities. They controlled Manchuria in effect, because the guerrillas had hardly developed the war in Manchuria. It was only a limited action. And of course the Comintern had no basis at all in Manchuria. And what happened was that Li Lishan was put in control of a few of the cities of the north. But then Stalin didn't wait for the Reds to take over Manchuria and hand over power to them. They gave Manchuria back to the Comintern, where after American imperialism had flown in the forces of the Comintern into the cities of Manchuria. And the reason why Stalin did that is he didn't want the victory of the Chinese Revolution that would have given a mass base, an independent base, to a potential rival. I mean, Mao Zedong praised Stalin later on in relation to the role that he played. But as a matter of fact, if Stalin would have lived, that was only really part of the kidology of the Stalinist bureaucracy, if you like, of trying to appear, of basing themselves upon the classical period of communism that allegedly existed in China. But if you look at, if Stalin would have lived, God help us, longer than 1953, if he would have dragged on for a bit longer, and the clash inevitably would have taken place between China and Russia, then Stalin would have been the arch enemy, and all his crimes in the past would have been resurrected. In the same way as the crimes of Li Shaoqi and other leaders going back to the year DOS, going back even to 1925-27. Mao Zedong had one thing, he had a long memory, which went back for about 50 years on this or that alleged crime of his opponent. So therefore, there was a natural opposition which was lodged in the situation between the way that the revolution developed in China itself. Now the other point that was raised by one of the comrades is about the role of the permanent revolution. I think it was Nicholas Johns from Reading raised this question in relation to the permanent revolution. He's absolutely correct in that, because the Chinese revolution actually bears out Trotsky's prognosis of the permanent revolution, that only by the social revolution can you carry through the bourgeois democratic revolution. except it's borne out in a caricatured form, in the sense that it's not the working class that played the role that Trotsky apportioned to them in the theory of the permanent revolution, but in this case it's Stalinists basing themselves upon a peasant army. And as a lot of the comrades have pointed out, you have the situation in the colonial and semi-colonial world of utter bankruptcy and collapse of that society, where the tasks of the bourgeois revolution are not delayed until the victory of the revolution in the West. And therefore, in that situation where a vacuum exists, it's possible for all kinds of developments to take place, for the bourgeois democratic revolution to be carried through by all kinds of forces or combinations of forces. In the case of China, it was a guerrilla war where the ex-leaders of the Communist Party, basing themselves upon the peasants, manoeuvring between the classes, carried through the expropriation of landlordism and capitalism. In the case of Cuba, it was Castro who started off as a bourgeois liberal, whose model, as a matter of fact, was America. That was the ideal of Castro as far as Cuba was concerned. But in the course of the revolution, like Mao himself, Mao had no conception of where he was going during the Second World War. But it was the whole concatenation of forces that forced him to go in that particular direction. In the case of Syria, it's a somewhat other development. In the case of Syria, it's the plebeian officers, is the petty bourgeois middle-class officer caste, basing themselves upon the proletariat and the peasants, even arming the working class, leaning on the working class to expropriate the landlords and the capitalists, and arming the peasantry. Once they carry through that task, disarming the working class and the peasantry, and creating a state in the image of Moscow, or in the image of Peking if it comes to that. In other words, the tasks of the revolution are not stayed, cannot be delayed, because the revolution in the advanced capitalist world has not been carried through. And as that comrade quite correctly said, Trotsky's epic phrase, which really sums up the situation in the colonial and semi-colonial world today: against a lion you use a gun, against a flea you use your forefinger and your thumb. For instance, we've always given the example in Czechoslovakia. The Russian Revolution took the Bolshevik Party to arm the masses to carry through the revolution. But in Czechoslovakia, all that it needed in 1948 was to push Jan Masaryk out of a 5-story window, and that was the end of the bourgeois counter-revolution. It was a little bit more than that, but in effect that's what it came down to. That was the end of the capitalist counter-revolution. We don't advocate that, that's the traditional methods of Stalinism, but that's how the counter-revolution was eliminated. And that's what's taken place in the colonial and semi-colonial world, which raises this question that a comrade quite correctly asked at the back about Trotsky's attitude in the 1930s, about the phrase that he used of a classical capitalist development. What Trotsky was saying there was that it was, and it might seem at first glance to contradict what the comrade I think was hinting at, is does this not contradict the theory of the permanent revolution? In the sense that if the Red Army would have come to the cities, leaving aside the factors that existed in the post-war period, could have not carried through the capitalist democratic revolution of giving land to the peasants, and then for the development of capitalism along the lines of Britain and so on taking place. Well, Trotsky said that couldn't be theoretically ruled out. Here you have an independent peasant movement which was given the land to the peasants in the course of the movement, coming to the cities, fusing with a section of the capitalist class. You could possibly have, theoretically, couldn't be ruled out, a certain development of capitalism. On the other hand, it's most likely what would have happened when we talk about a classical capitalist development. You could have had a situation, for instance, Mexico, or for that matter the example that I gave this morning of Bolivia, where you'd have a much more thoroughgoing land reform than was the case in the past. In a certain sense, land was given to the peasants, but because it was a dependent society, dependent upon imperialism, wouldn't of course completely expropriate imperialism. At the same time, the land reform would be carried out, but over a period of time that land reform would be undone. That's what Trotsky was driving at when he said, well, that's what would happen if the Red Army entered the cities. It wouldn't mean the complete solving of the bourgeois democratic revolution. At best, the partial solution of the problems of the bourgeois democratic revolution. But that's not what happened, as we know. On the contrary, what happened was because of these special concatenation of forces, the weakness of the bourgeois and so on, we had the carrying through of the capitalist democratic, the carrying through the capitalist democratic revolution in China, and the establishment of a planned economy. Now, just on one other question that was raised by Heather, I think it was, about the role of the Communist Party. It's related to history, really. What was the role of the CP and how was it organised in its first period? Was it organised on the model of the Bolshevik Party in Russia? Well, we have to see, first of all, that all the best examples of the Russian Revolution and of the Bolshevik Party were drawn on by the Chinese Communist Party in its first and best period. But it was a very young Communist Party. It was very inexperienced. I gave the figure that in 1923, the Communist Party had 521 members, 60,000 in 1927. That's an indication of the way that the revolution developed. But the degeneration of the Russian Revolution began in 1923. The degeneration of the Comintern began in 1923. And from the traditions of Lenin and Trotsky in the Comintern of allowing the leadership of each party to develop and to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, what happened was that all the worst traditions of manoeuvre and intrigue began to develop in the different parties of the Communist Party. Instead of an independent leadership, what happened is that Stalin and Zinoviev wanted stooges who could dance to their tune, in effect, who couldn't think out problems for themselves. So therefore we had the trappings of the Communist Party, or the Bolshevik Party in Russia, but without the tradition, without the experience, without the independent working class leadership as well. And therefore that's why the advisors of Stalin's of the Chinese Communist Party, such as Borodin, played such a monstrous role in the course of the 25-27 revolution. Now, how do you go from this problem of a small movement to a mass organisation? Something which the militant tendency undoubtedly will be posed with in the next 5 or 10 years in Britain. That's our perspective, that is our aim, to go from a grouping which has perhaps the support of thousands at the present time, to a grouping of tens of hundreds of thousands at a later stage, and moreover, that will recruit into its ranks, that will recruit support to its ideas, to be more exact, from people, from predominantly industrial workers, who won't have all the time to study and to go into questions, perhaps not even as thoroughly as we're doing this here today. But so long as they're industrial workers and accept the basic ideas of the revolution, of the revolutionary program, so long as you have a trained cadre inside that movement, inside that organisation. The Bolshevik Party, for instance, went from a handful of 10,000 on the eve of the revolution into of 5 or 10,000 on the eve of the revolution, I forget the exact figure now, to an organisation that led a nation of 170 million. How did they recruit 150,000 workers into their ranks? The way that they did is that the backbone of this cadre of trained workers, who in turn were able to recruit not one or two, but tens and fifteens of workers and integrate them into the organisation. And that's a problem that will be posed for our movement in the future. In the best period, in the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party was able to do that, as a matter of fact. Now, in relation to the other question that was raised, which is the major point really, the main bone of contention that was raised in the course of the discussion itself, and we really should pat our comrade on the back for raising this question, the comrade from Hong Kong, is this problem of the guerrilla war. And I think in the course of his last contribution, perhaps there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of our appraisal, of our characterization of the regime in China, regime in Vietnam, the regime in Eastern Europe and in Russia for that matter. Because we have to be quite clear about this. We are not opposed to guerrilla war. Let's be absolutely clear about this. We're not opposed to guerrilla war. Guerrilla war is the traditional methods of the peasantry. And where you have a predominant peasant population, obviously guerrilla war will take place. Guerrilla war took place in the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks didn't oppose guerrilla war against the landlords and the capitalists. They didn't oppose guerrilla war against the white armies. But the difference between China and Russia was that it was the industrial working class in the cities that led this guerrilla war, that gave the necessary leadership to this guerrilla war. Guerrilla war throughout millennia, throughout more than 2,000 years, has been the traditional struggle of the Chinese peasantry. There's nothing new. In the course of 1925 up to 1949, there was nothing new, except it was on a higher plane, had much greater possibilities of success. But there was nothing new about the movement of the peasantry at that particular time. All of the methods of guerrilla war. And moreover, in Angola and Mozambique, we didn't oppose the guerrilla war there, where it was a tiny proletariat that existed. But what we said in all those instances, the Marxist tendency would base itself upon the proletariat. In China, for instance, the differences between the Trotskyists and the Stalinists and the alleged Trotskyists in China made some absolutely criminal blunders in the course of the Chinese Revolution. For instance, they drew no distinction between the Comintern armies and the Red Armies, incredibly, during the period of 47 to 49, which is absolutely incredible. One couldn't support that position. You'd have to give critical support to the Red Armies against the Comintern at that particular stage. But the point is that the Trotskyists, as a small force, based themselves upon the proletariat. They were then accused by the Stalinists of underestimating the peasantry, which was the main force for the revolution. Exactly the same accusation was made by the social revolutionaries in Russia against the Bolsheviks. Let's remember that the Bolsheviks in Russia started off to win the peasantry. Lenin said that's the main task for carrying through the bourgeois democratic revolution. But to win the peasantry, we must first of all win the working class. Only through winning the working class would then we find the road to the peasantry and mobilize them behind our banner to carry through the bourgeois democratic revolution. Where the peasantry does become the main force, where the leaders or ex-leaders of the proletariat, let's remember that Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai had lived in the mountains and the rural areas for 20 years. In the language of Marxism, conditions determine consciousness. They'd imbibed the whole atmosphere of the rural areas. They were the traditional Bonapartes, if you like, who based themselves upon a peasant movement. There were no organs of self-expression, and Soviets existing in the so-called red liberated areas of China. At best there was a form of consultation, but there was no democratic control by the masses in these areas over the leaders of the Red Army. And therefore, in that situation, it's inevitable, when they entered the cities, that the kind of developments as we sketched out would take place. Now, what would that mean in relation to the perspective in the colonial and semi-colonial world today? We're realists. Marxists are realists. We're not utopians. We have to recognize that in the case of Angola, of Mozambique, of the developments, for instance, in other parts of Asia, the way the revolution is likely to develop at this stage will probably be a peasant war. Even where the Marxist forces would base themselves on the proletariat, the movement will probably take the form of a peasant war. And the reasons for that are very easy to explain. Because first of all, the tasks of the revolution won't stop. They won't be delayed. But secondly, it's the lag of the world revolution itself, particularly of the revolution in the advanced capitalist world. The reason why all these peculiar developments have taken place in China, in Vietnam, in Angola, in Mozambique, the reason why you've had not healthy worker states established, but what Marxists would call deformed worker states right from the beginning, is because of the relationship of world forces, of the weakness of capitalism on the one side and the strength of Stalinism on the other. That's the reason why. And these regimes have acted as a model for these societies in the colonial and semi-colonial world. But to answer the point that the comrade raised at the back, is it not possible for a clash to exist between the revolution in the advanced capitalist world and the colonial and semi-colonial world? Is there not a clash of interest between the workers of the West and the workers in Africa, Asia and Latin America? We don't believe that. Because if one revolution was to take place in one advanced industrial country, if in a country like Russia, where the working class was a minority, the peasants were a majority, if one victory was to take place in Russia, it was the 10 days that shook the world. If we had that in Britain, with the highly cultured proletariat, with its long democratic traditions, you imagine a movement taking place in Britain, it would immediately detonate movements in Europe. It would lead to the end of the Stalinist regimes in Eastern Europe, certainly in Eastern Europe, and also in China as well. It was no accident that at the time of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, in contradistinction to what happened in Czechoslovakia, not just Khrushchev, but Tito and Mao Zedong urged Khrushchev to intervene against the Hungarian Revolution. Why? Because the success of the Hungarian Revolution, of the establishment of workers' democracy, would have led to the overthrow of the Stalinist regime in China. Even though the regime in China can still develop the productive forces, the events of the last couple of years have shown that the best elements of the Chinese youth, of the Chinese working class, are groping in the direction of the ideas of democracy. of workers' democracy. A few put forward the idea of capitalist democracy, but most of them are putting forward the idea of workers' democracy. And therefore, with all the resources that would exist in the advanced capitalist world, the tremendous talents that would be brought to the fore as a result of the revolution in Europe, linking up with the revolution in Eastern Europe and Russia, imagine the enormous potential that would be there. It would then be possible to create, if you like, a paradise out of the deserts. It'd be possible to transform India, Asia, Latin America within a generation. Now, I would say within a year, within 10 years rather. A year is a little bit of an optimistic perspective. Maybe within 10 years to transform the situation completely, whereby you would have a real international division of labour between the peoples of the world. Instead of them all trying to create their own industrial infrastructure, their own steel industry in each individual country, the real planning of the productive forces of the whole of the planet by the peoples of the world. You wouldn't have then a class as you have now, because it wouldn't be a question of exploitation. From the advanced capitalist world, we'd mobilise the youth with all the talents that they would have, and they wouldn't go there like these charity organisations now, who go there trying to help the poor people of Africa, Asia and Latin America, and some of them are very sincere individuals, we can't doubt that for a minute, but it's like a man with an egg cup that's trying to empty the ocean. That's the role of aid as far as India, Asia and Latin America is concerned. What we would have is the lever of a powerful industrial base, mobilising the talents of the youth in particular, who would undoubtedly link up with their brothers and sisters in the colonial and semi-colonial world, and would play that role. I didn't answer the question that was raised by Bill and Anne about the working class in the cities. I don't have much time to answer that, but there is a very simple answer really to why the working class didn't play the role in 44-49 that it did in 1925-27. And on the one side it was the ruthless repression in the areas controlled by the Comintern and by the Communist Party, let us remember, as far as the working class movement is concerned. I gave an example of the role of Mao in relation to this movement. But in 1945, for instance, the Communist Party leaders condemned the labour maintenance law of October 1945 because it set wages too high. There was a whole series of strikes following the evacuation of the Japanese in 1945. As soon as that took place, it was denounced by the Communist Party leaders, where Mao, for instance, urged the workers to cooperate with the capitalists so that maximum production can be maintained. I could give you 1,001 quotes of that particular character. And therefore the proletariat was made absolutely clear to them between 46 and 49 that if there's any attempt to move independently, it would have no support from the Communist Party first of all, and secondly it would meet with the crushing by the forces of the Red Army of any independent movement of the proletariat itself. And therefore there was no possibility in that situation, unless they would have had at their head the leadership of a revolutionary organisation, of a revolutionary party, of a mass party, of a Trotskyist movement, in effect, that would have been capable of arming the Chinese working class, to create Soviets in 1945, and then to appeal to the rank and file of the Red Army, to create Soviets in the peasant areas. If you would have had a force of that character, the whole way the Chinese Revolution would have developed would have been entirely different. But that wasn't the case, because the Trotskyists were very small. It's very difficult in this discussion to give you a picture of the monstrous repression. For instance, just in the early 30s, 3 central committees of the Chinese Communist Party were wiped out in the space of about 4 years. By the way, some of them were betrayed by the Communist Party leaders to the Comintern agents. There was a number of examples of that, which I don't have, unfortunately, the time to go into, which Harold Isaacs deals with in The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. And the last point is on the point that's linked to what the comrade from Hong Kong said and Ray raised, and is the revolution of 44-49 the tragedy of the Chinese Revolution? No, it's not. Because the book, The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution, was about the 25-27 events, not 44-49. One couldn't describe the events of 44-49 as a tragedy. It's the second greatest event in the history of mankind. 1/4 of mankind stepped onto the stage of history. Nobody can take away from what happened the enormous splendour, the enormous significance of that particular movement. And it was an enormously progressive movement as well. The nationalisation of land and land to the tiller, the nationalisation of industry, the development of China along modern lines. Some of the experts are now forecasting that by the end of this century, China will be equivalent to the West. They think it won't be able to catch up to the West. Make no mistake about it. The advantages of a planned economy, despite the inefficiency of a monstrous bureaucracy, can mean that China can develop with 7 league boots in this period, in contradistinction to what's going to happen in the West, if that regime lasts for as long as 20 years. And that's entirely dubious. It's dubious, rather, given the way that events are likely to develop in the advanced capitalist world. And therefore, what we have is a planned economy, but a one-party totalitarian regime. Some features similar to Russia, some features which are different, but fundamentally a regime which is parallel with the regime that existed with Russia in the interwar period. Enormously progressive in one sense. This is this terrible word dialectics that we have to use in relation to describing China, which is a Marxist way, if you like, of saying that we have to look at phenomena from all sides, an all-sided situation. Very progressive in one sense, because of a one-party totalitarian regime. The Chinese working class in the next period, not by this little tinkering and dickering with the system, of this little change or that little change, but by a root and branch change, not of the social basis of the regime, but they've been established by the revolution of 44-49, but by changing the political superstructure in China. To be more exact, by carrying through a political revolution to overthrow the bureaucracy in China and establish workers' democracy. The working class in China will have to pay for that because of the way that the revolution has developed. But that's something that you can go into more detail in the course of the discussion tomorrow. And I think in the 2 discussions that we've had today, we've laid a firm foundation to approach the problems of China today and the developments that are taking place in China today in order to arm us with the enormous upheavals that will take place throughout the whole of the Stalinist world in this period that we're going into, that will be paralleled by the movements of our class in the advanced capitalist world, which in turn is laying the basis for the creation of a socialist world federation that will end once and for all the miseries and the indignation, not only for the colonial and semi-colonial masses that we've spoken about in this discussion, but the increasing problems of the workers in the advanced capitalist world as well.